We've been doing a series this month on Let Freedom Ring. And today I want to talk about Spirits in Rebellion, which is a book that many of you have heard me refer to in the past, and we'll talk a little bit more about it today. And as time passes, some of you in class are going to be studying it in more detail. For those of you who are history buffs, you know that 19th century America was notable for many things made new as we let our freedom ring throughout this country, throughout this hemisphere, and even out into the world. It showed up in agriculture, it showed up in industrial expansion, it showed up in use of vast resources of timber, of oil, of minerals. It showed up in the development of advanced education institutions and rapid growth of population centers taking place. And there was something even more intriguing that was unfolding. I'm going to use your weight here. Thank you. New religious and spiritual sects were also springing up throughout the Western Hemisphere, some of them by breaking away from more established denominations, and others creating what Charles Braden, in this book, Spirits in Rebellion, called peculiarly new forms of genuine American religious faiths. Well, guess what? That's the grouping where we belong. A peculiarly new form of genuine American faith. And that grouping is what gave rise to this heavy book that Braden published called Spirits in Rebellion. Many of these groups were of only passing importance, I have to tell you. Never became widely held, eventually disappeared. But several of them have gone on to become national or let it go, I'm done with it. National or internationally recognized groups in character. Some of these new thought persuasions, interesting phrase, isn't it? New thought persuasions contained elements of Oriental or Indian religious ideas, along with Christian thought and forms of Western thought. But the really unique faith that originated in America was that which developed around the healing of disease. That was later expanded to the realization that healing and every good thing is possible through a right relationship with universal mind. The term metaphysical was coined during this time, and the guy who seems to have been the major player in the initial development of metaphysics as we know it in the Western Hemisphere was Phineas Quimby. Any of you heard the name Phineas Quimby? Okay, good. That's a name commonly familiar to our ministerial students and ministers, but not always others. So good on you. You've been doing your homework. Mary Baker Eddy, who was the founder of Christian Science, was first a patient and subsequently a success story of Quimby's. Quimby himself had previously been healed from tuberculosis through a technique that he developed. And Mary Baker Eddy was also healed of a chronic condition through some of the techniques that Quimby developed, and she took even further in what became Christian Science. But I have to tell you, old Phineas was no evangelist. He never organized a religion. He never even put together a multi-marketing group. In fact, other than in the rather tight circles in which he moved, no one really knew of him. When he died, he had no successor other than patients and students who knew that what he called his system worked. Eventually, after a lot of urging by their peers, a couple named Dresser stepped in and began to practice what they called the Quimby system of the mental treatment of diseases. But it was Quimby's original student, Mary Baker Eddy, who, though on her own path, started to influence other people as well. And one of the primary people that she influenced was Emma Curtis Hopkins. And we use Emma Curtis Hopkins a lot in our classwork. In fact, we have a class on her use of personal power that is an incredibly deep and successful course in understanding the power of the mental belief system in healing, whether it's physical disease, mental disease, emotional, or spiritual. It works in every arena. And it was Emma Curtis Hopkins to whom people like Ernest Holmes, the founder of Science of Mind, and Charles Fillmore, the founder of Unity, gravitated. So I bring this very short synopsis. You know, if you look at the book and then you listen to what I just said, you realize that it's a really short synopsis. As a snapshot of our heritage as spirits in rebellion. Young country, new ideas, a lot unfolding, and it wasn't just in industry that this was happening. It was happening on the spiritual plane as well. So what we believe and practice in the science of mind, the techniques that we use, such as spiritual mind treatment, affirmation, meditation, are not without a background of proven effort and success. If in discussing this with someone who's not familiar with metaphysics, you find that there is a certain rejection or hesitation to this being booga booga kind of thing, or New Age kind of thing, it is not. Quite the opposite. It's time-tested and proven, although it may not appear in scientific journals. Well, yes, it does sometimes now. 100 years ago, not so much. But more and more now, science and metaphysics are running more in parallel by recognition from both of those persuasions. And Braden's book, Spirits in Rebellion, lists dozens and dozens of movements that sprang up all over the Western Hemisphere, and eventually in England, in Europe, in Africa, Australia, and Japan. In fact, now there are even religious science or science of mind study groups and teaching centers in what was once the USSR, now Russia, and a number of satellite countries, teaching the science of mind. As a matter of fact, we have 2 ministers in Centers for Spiritual Living who were particularly busy at that as the USSR was breaking into individualized countries. The Grabowskis, Barbara and Bob Grabowski, were in Russia or the USSR and starting these study groups and teaching centers, some of which are now actually church centers, as there's been an opportunity for them to become legitimate in those countries. But the success of each type of new thought or metaphysical teaching continues to be dependent upon 6 factors that are identified in the late 1800s by what was then called the International Metaphysical League. And I want to share those factors with you because they are a jumping off point that has brought us to where we are today. So those 6 factors are optimistic, constructive, broad, tolerant, non-sectarian, and impersonal. And I want to differentiate between non-sectarian and non-denominational. Because in the Western Hemisphere, in today's world, the term non-denominational is typically used to mean that it is not specifically a Christian denomination. It is any one of many Christian denominations. So you've heard me say before, there are over 900 denominations of Christianity within the United States alone. So there's some separation and some division and some fission going on there. So when you see in an advertisement, for example, that a church or a spiritual center is non-denominational, the chances are 899 out of 900 that it is a Christian-based organization. And I'm not criticizing that, I'm just identifying and observing that. Non-sectarian, on the other hand, is a broader brush. And it might be Christian, it might be something else. So you will hear us refer to Centers for Spiritual Living and the teaching of the science of mind as a trans-denominational teaching, meaning it cuts across a variety of denominations or sects, because it pulls in some of the Buddhist, it pulls in some of the Muslim, it pulls in some of Judaism, it certainly pulls in some of Christianity, and what we would not classify as religious, but spiritual practices. So we are open to the truth, however it shows up, wherever it shows up, and in whatever language it shows up. So again, I bring you this short synopsis in order to emphasize that what this spiritual rebellion is all about is the demonstrating and the practicing of those 6 factors. Because the meaning of the word rebellion is to refuse to accept a code or a convention of behavior. And I would embellish that by saying any code or convention of behavior that no longer works for the greatest good of the individual and of humanity in general. What you hear us say is, and at no one else's expense. So here are those 6 factors again: optimistic, constructive, broad, tolerant, non-sectarian, and impersonal. Impersonal. And I'll elaborate on that in a moment. Here's what that rebellion has brought forth from the 1800s. 1, that we rebel from pessimism into optimism. 2, that we rebel from destructive ideas and actions into constructive ones. 3, that we turn from narrow, self-serving thinking into broad, all-encompassing service. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't develop our own core of strength, understanding, and well-being, because we know that is central to being of value to anyone else. First, the roots of the tree must go down in order for the tree to grow a canopy of leaves and bloom and bear fruit. 4, that we turn from distrust or hate into tolerance and acceptance. 5, that we move from exclusive religious ritual and dogma into non-sectarian, all-embracing practice and recognition of truth, that we are all one. And for those of you who have seen that DVD, With One Voice, it's the most beautiful expression of what I just said, of anything in my experience. And then 6, that we release our own individual need to always be right, and to recognize that God in us, as us, is us, that this creative intelligence is present by means of all that it creates. Now I want to jump back to that comment I made about impersonal. When we refer to God or spirit or divine intelligence or creative energy or universal life force or whatever you choose to call that source of being, we refer to it as impersonal in order to establish that it doesn't play favorites, that it doesn't appear in the male and not the female, or the female and not the male, because it is all things, it is both and all. That it does not differentiate between the color of skin or the amount of education, because you see it's within all of that anyway, isn't it? Yes. But because it is within all that it creates, it does not play favorites, and it does not have a personality, because if it had a personality, it would be mine. Not yours. Or yours. Not yours. So you see, when we begin to understand what that means, it doesn't mean that it's cold, it doesn't mean that it's aloof, it doesn't mean that it's unapproachable. It means that it is all personalities, that it is all creative expression, that it is all of the feminine and the masculine, that it is unlimited in its expression, and so in order to be unlimited, it cannot be personal. That doesn't mean that we are abandoned to a cold scientific formula. Quite the opposite. This expresses best through what we know as love. And when we understand universal love, then love at the human experience level is a piece of cake. So, understanding that this creative life force within us, is it, with a capital I, that it practices no favoritism, and that it gives of itself freely and personally and completely, then we begin to understand what the potential within ourselves is. And that the potential within ourselves giving out to that which is around us is that same process, that universal mind, that God, that divine intelligence, that the life energy is producing all the time. And we are in kinship with that, in partnership with that, in step with that. So whether you decide to get a copy of this book or not, whether you decide to read it or not, because you don't get a whole lot out of it from the nightstand. It's got to be closer than that. Or, or even use it for your weight training program, because you could, for starters. This morning, at least, you've had a peek into our metaphysical roots, because this was and continues to be the evolution of thought in the human race, an idea whose time has come. And you and I, how fortunate we are riding this wave of conscious spiritual evolution, culturally, creatively, mindfully, as we choose. And obviously, those of us here in the room today have chosen, and so many more like us now. It's no mistake that books like Biology of Belief, for example, How God Changes Your Brain, and so many others now. Arliss and I have almost started a book club, because every week now she's telling me about one that she's found, and I'm telling her about some that I know of. And I've got a book for you, too, that I want to talk to you about. I found it in my library. It took me a while, but I found it. but there's such a wealth of information and so easily available now as compared to 50 years ago. It was a challenge just to find them and then to obtain them. And she goes on Amazon, she's got them in 48 hours. I go to Devore's, and we've got them in 48 hours, which, you know, on the island of Hawaii is not bad, come to think of it. Even faster if you download it right into your computer. So it's a no-brainer, for example, that our two organizations, United Center for Spiritual Living and International Center for Spiritual Living, merged about 4 or 5 years ago. I don't even remember how long ago it was now, because it's so organic for us that we not only are teaching oneness, but we're practicing it as an integrated organization. And that's what a conscious spiritual evolution is all about. It's making all things new. The ideas that come to us, we now put into the mix of what's happening in our world at this moment. Not 100 years ago, we've updated. Not 1,000 years ago, we've updated. And we continue to update how we can express it in words that make sense in today's world through the use of communication capabilities in today's world. So this is all about letting freedom ring in the expansion of our belief system that, first of all, supports our own health and well-being, and secondly, supports those around us who are within the confluence, and then on out into our communities, our islands, and into the world. And so it is.